Usually when we talk about a medical diagnosis, there's this comforting expectation of precision,
Right,
right?
absolutely.
Like you break your arm, the X-ray machine lights up, and it shows that jagged white line right there on the screen.
Right, the doctor just points at it, says, there it is.
Exactly. Broken or not broken. It's a completely binary, clean situation.
It is comforting. I mean, human beings naturally gravitate toward things that can be categorized perfectly. We want to see the underlying structure of a problem without any ambiguity.
But then you step into the world of modern American politics, and suddenly that X-ray machine is it's completely shattered.
Oh, complete.
We're looking at a diagnostic landscape of a political career today that is, well, honestly, it's murky. It is full of friction.
Yeah, to truly understand a politician operating at the highest levels right now, you really have to reconcile actions that seem, I mean, entirely contradictory on the surface.
Right. So, for instance, consider this scenario. A United States senator stands at a wooden lectern on the Senate floor. He stands there for exactly 25 hours, 5 minutes, and 59 seconds.
Which is just physically, that's astounding.
Right. And during this entire period, he consumes absolutely no water. None.
Wow.
He reads continuously from 10 massive binders containing over, I think it was 1,100 pages of materials.
Yeah, something like that. Over 1,000 pages.
And in doing so, he breaks a historical record that was previously held by a notorious segregationist. You really have to ask yourself why.
Right. What drives a human being to push their physical and biological limits to the absolute brink for what is essentially a procedural protest?
Exactly. And that tension is exactly what we're unpacking today. We've gathered a really fascinating stack of materials for this analysis.
We have. It's a really diverse set of sources.
Yeah, we're pulling from official press releases, some incredibly complex AI-driven legislative analyses, municipal policy archives, an environmental news organization's profile, and even a highly detailed Supreme Court amicus brief.
Right. Which is quite the mix.
It is. Our mission here is to synthesize all these materials to construct a comprehensive mechanical profile of United States Senator Cory Booker.
Yeah, we're tracing his evolution from a very hands-on, headline-making local mayor in Newark, New Jersey, to a national figure navigating the extreme polarization of the current political landscape.
And it's a remarkable trajectory, it really is.
Oh, for sure. We'll be looking very closely at how local governance philosophies and survival tactics translate, or, well, in some cases, completely fail to translate when they're exposed to the brutal light of the national stage.
So whether you are fascinated by the mechanics of political strategy or curious about how municipal finance dictates national ambition, or you just really want to understand the biological and procedural reality of surviving a 25-hour speech, this analysis is custom-tailored for you.
Definitely. And just a quick heads up regarding the terrain we're crossing today.
Yeah, good point.
The documents we're reviewing, they touch the third rails of modern politics. We're analyzing strategies regarding the second Donald Trump administration, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, the economic realities of universal health care, and sweeping criminal justice reform.
Right. And our job here is not to take a side. We are not endorsing any left-wing or right-wing viewpoints.
Exactly. We are strictly here to act as your guides to the strategies exactly as they are presented in these source documents.
Yep. Just mapping out the architecture of a modern political career, completely impartially.
Because analyzing these strategies objectively, without the cloud of, partisan cheerleading, is really the only way to genuinely understand the mechanics of the legislative landscape. We have to look at the machinery, not just the finished product.
I like to look at modern political maneuvering sort of like a complex computer operating system.
Oh, I like that analogy.
Right. You have some politicians who focus almost entirely on the back-end code. They're writing quiet, bipartisan bills, adjusting the foundational architecture of the law.
Negotiating in committee rooms where the cameras are turned off.
Exactly. Then you have other politicians who focus entirely on the user interface.
The UI, right.
Yeah. They're making viral, highly visible public stands, generating massive social media metrics, and capturing the user's immediate attention.
And the overarching question for you to consider as we map out this profile is how effectively does Cory Booker merge that quiet back-end code with the loud user interface?
The marathon man versus the algorithm. Let's start with the marathon man.
Okay, let's do it.
We're looking at early spring, specifically the speech protesting the administration. The logistics alone are just physically punishing.
Oh, yeah. Lasting over 25 hours, he surpassed Strom Thurmond's 1957 record, which was 24 hours and 18 minutes.
And the sources note that Booker explicitly stated this was a poetic victory, right? Because Thurman's original filibuster was aimed at blocking the Civil Rights Act.
The historical resonance is undeniable. Booker noted that it deeply irked him that the longest speech on the Senate floor was held by someone actively trying to stop people like him from even having the right to vote, let alone serve in the United States Senate.
Right. But beyond the historical poetry of overwriting that record, the physical logistics of pulling this off are just brutal.
Yeah, the preparation involved fasting and deliberately dehydrating himself for hours beforehand.
Because the rules of the Senate floor are merciless in this regard. If you leave the floor to use the restroom, you yield the floor.
The speech is immediately over, you lose your control of the chamber.
Precisely. You have to maintain absolute physical presence and speak more or less continuously.
He noted afterward that because of the severe dehydration strategy, he didn't even feel the biological urge to use the restroom.
Which is wild.
I know, but he felt profoundly, dangerously dehydrated by the end. Mentally, he had to sustain focus, using 10 heavy binders prepared by his staff.
We're talking about over 1,100 pages of talking points, right? Thousands of constituent letters and historical references heavily highlighting the legacy of civil rights icon John Lewis to anchor the narrative of the speech.
Right. So who or what were the targets of this massive 25-hour marathon?
He was utilizing this time to protest the second Donald Trump presidency. Specifically, he was targeting the proposed elimination of the Department of Education and the operations of Elon Musk's newly formed Department of Government Efficiency.
He read highly personal testimonies from people facing eviction, public school educators terrified of losing their funding, and individuals affected by aggressive immigration enforcement.
But he didn't just read continuously in a vacuum, did he? There's a procedural loophole he exploited to physically survive those 25 hours.
There is, and understanding this procedural strategy is crucial to understanding the mechanics of the Senate. Under Senate rules, a speaker who holds the floor can yield for questions without actually yielding the floor entirely.
Okay.
So Booker utilized this mechanism brilliantly.
Yeah.
Over the course of the 25 hours, he fielded questions from 35 Democratic colleagues and 1 independent colleague.
And a question in the United States Senate is rarely just a simple question, right?
Exactly. A friendly colleague can stand up and ask a highly elaborate, multi-part question that essentially functions as a 15-minute speech of their own.
Right.
This procedural maneuver allowed Booker to briefly stop speaking, rest his vocal cords, lean against his desk, and gather his thoughts, all while his colleagues kept the clock running under the guise of an ongoing inquiry.
But here is where the user interface of modern politics becomes the main story. This wasn't just happening on C-SPAN for political junkies and insomniacs.
I know, not at all.
The social media strategy deployed alongside this speech was massive. According to the sources, a single live stream of this speech garnered 350 million likes.
That's just a staggering number.
It is. He had hundreds of thousands of concurrent viewers on platforms like TikTok, YouTube, and Instagram throughout the night.
He was utilizing digital platforms to completely bypass the traditional media filters, the cable news anchors, and the newspaper editors.
Yeah, beaming this grueling physical act directly into the public's hands.
Which brings us to a fascinating contrast. You have this incredibly emotional, physical spectacle. It is a primal act of resistance that serves to rally a demoralized party base.
Right.
But then we look at his AI report card from a bit later. This is a newly developed, objective, AI-driven legislative analysis service.
Right, the algorithm.
Yeah. It evaluates politicians based purely on societal impact, completely devoid of partisan emotion, social media metrics, or historical poetry.
And this emotionless algorithm evaluated Cory Booker's legislative output and gave him an A rating.
An A rating from a cold calculating machine.
The sources detail that the AI specifically noted his dual approach to legislation. On one hand, he authors these massive, sweeping national bills, things like cracking down on pharmaceutical pricing monopolies or guaranteeing jobs in high unemployment areas.
And on the other hand, he writes highly targeted, incredibly specific laws. The AI cited his bills addressing maternal mortality rates, unsafe school meals, and providing legal counsel in local eviction courts.
But the metric that stands out most in that AI analysis, the reason he achieved the A rating, is his precision score.
Right.
The algorithm determined that 98% of his bills accurately target causal mechanisms.
Okay, we need to slow down and unpack that. What does an algorithm actually mean when it says a bill targets a causal mechanism? Walk me through how a machine evaluates that.
It's a profound shift in how we analyze policy. Traditional political punditry often looks at whether a bill sounds good or addresses a visible problem. The AI looks at the mathematical chain of events.
Ah, I see.
A causal mechanism means the root, structural cause of a societal issue, rather than just the symptom. For example, consider the issue of homelessness.
Okay.
A reactive piece of legislation targeting a symptom might provide federal funding to build more homeless shelters. The AI would score that lower on precision because it doesn't stop people from becoming homeless in the first place.
Right. It's just catching them after they fall off the cliff.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But one of Booker's targeted bills focused on funding legal representation for tenants in eviction courts.
Okay, so intervening early.
The AI analyzes the data and recognizes that lack of legal representation during an eviction proceeding is a massive causal mechanism for homelessness. If you disrupt that specific link in the chain by providing a lawyer, you mathematically prevent the downstream societal outcome.
Achieving a 98% precision rate means the algorithm verified that almost all of his proposed legislation is logically designed to disrupt these root causes.
That is fascinating. So when we put the two together, you have a 25-hour dehydrating viral spectacle capturing 350 million likes on one side.
And a 98% algorithmically verified precision score on the other side.
It tells us a great deal about the duality of modern political capital.
It really does. The 25-hour speech serves as a massive megaphone. It commands national attention, energizes the donor base, and creates a narrative of relentless physical fight.
The AI score proves he isn't just a showman operating an empty user interface.
Right. The spectacle provides the political capital, the leverage, and the attention. The precision legislation is the back-end code where he actually spends that capital. One without the other is arguably ineffective in the current hyperpolarized climate.
But, I have to push back here because this is where the operating system metaphor hits a glitch.
Oh, how so?
Did that 25-hour speech actually accomplish its immediate stated procedural goal? He was ostensibly delaying the confirmation of a nominee for NATO ambassador. Did his biological sacrifice actually stop that confirmation from happening?
It did not. The sources are clear on the timeline. Immediately after Booker yielded the floor to a standing ovation from his colleagues, the Senate resumed normal business, called the roll, and confirmed the nominee by a vote of 52 to 45.
Wait, so the nominee gets confirmed anyway, the exact same way they would have if he had just stayed home?
Essentially, yes.
Was this just a 25-hour PR stunt? He sacrificed his body, but the back-end code didn't change a single bit. Does a 25-hour speech matter if the vote goes the exact same way it would have a day earlier?
This is the crux of evaluating modern political efficacy. If you view success strictly through the lens of blocking a specific nominee on that specific day, the speech failed completely. The mechanical outcome in the chamber did not change.
Right.
However, you have to look at the secondary mechanics of the action. Controlling the national narrative for a full news cycle, demonstrating physical commitment to a cause when the electorate feels cynical, and gathering 350 million digital interactions, that is measurable leverage.
So it's about the long game.
Exactly. That digital engagement translates into future political momentum, massive fundraising capabilities, and the ability to dictate the terms of the next legislative battle. In a system where the minority party lacks the votes to block a nominee, the resistance itself becomes the tangible product.
So the interface drives the user engagement, which funds the long-term survival of the system, even if it didn't stop that specific piece of malware from installing, so to speak.
That's a great way to put it.
Now, a senator who understands how to use massive digital live streams to rally a nation didn't just appear out of nowhere.
No, definitely not.
This highly media-savvy approach, this understanding of the user interface, was forged in the streets of Newark, New Jersey, where he built a national brand on local heroics.
Let's trace this back to the origin story, because he actually comes from a very elite, highly insulated background before he ever stepped foot in Newark.
Yes, his academic and early professional credentials are formidable. We're talking about the highest echelons of elite institutional grooming.
He played varsity football at Stanford University, earned a master's degree there, was awarded a prestigious Rhodes Scholarship to study at Oxford, and then graduated from Yale Law School.
That is a resume that essentially writes its own ticket to a seven-figure salary on Wall Street or a partnership at a white shoe law firm in Manhattan.
Oh, without a doubt.
But instead, he takes a hard left turn. He moves to Newark And he doesn't just move to a nice gentrified suburb outside the city. He starts a nonprofit to provide legal services for low-income tenants fighting slumlords.
Right, and he physically moves his residence into the Brick Towers housing project. The sources note he lived there from 1998 until the buildings were ultimately condemned and demolished in 2006.
This period is the foundational bedrock of his political identity. As a 29-year-old city councilman, he actively challenged the entrenched, multi-generational political machine of Newark.
He positioned himself not just as an Ivy League reformer coming in with white papers, but as someone who was literally living within the systemic failures he was attempting to fix.
Experiencing the broken elevators, the lack of heating, the neighborhood violence firsthand, it lent absolute credibility to his reform message.
And that credibility leads directly to the era of the supermayor, spanning from his election as mayor in 2006 to his departure for the Senate.
The municipal archives detail these incredible headline-grabbing acts that seem almost fictional. We're talking about the sitting mayor of a major American city chasing down an armed robber in front of City Hall,
Which is wild.
running into a burning building to save a woman's life, sustaining second-degree burns in the process.
Personally shoveling his constituents' driveways after a massive blizzard.
Right, riding on night patrol in the passenger seat with the local police.
One of the sources explicitly noted that it reads like a comic book narrative. It was an unprecedented masterclass in personal branding and municipal visibility.
But underneath that superhero narrative, underneath the viral tweets of him delivering diapers in a snowstorm, the economic reality of Newark was incredibly grim and mathematically unforgiving.
Yeah, when he assumed the office of mayor, he inherited a $118 million structural budget deficit. The city was fundamentally broken on a financial level.
We need to explain how a city actually falls into a $118 million hole, because you can't shovel your way out of a municipal deficit. How did that happen, and what was the back-end code he had to write to fix it?
A municipal deficit of that scale usually stems from a decades-long erosion of the tax base. When middle-class residents and large businesses leave a city, property values plummet and the tax revenues dry up.
Okay.
However, the fixed costs of running a city, pensions, police and fire departments, sanitation, infrastructure maintenance, either remain static or increase due to inflation.
So you're suddenly trying to pay for 100% of the city's needs with 60% of the revenue.
Exactly. The required actions to balance a budget in that scenario are painful and deeply unpopular. Booker had to cut municipal spending drastically. He was forced to lay off hundreds of police officers and municipal employees.
Which is politically toxic for a mayor.
Extremely. And most brutally, he had to push through a 20% property tax increase just to balance the books.
So you have a superhero mayor who has to lay off the police and raise your taxes by a fifth. And because he couldn't magically fix all the deeply rooted issues with a broken tax base, he executed what the sources call an outsider strategy.
He realized the money wasn't inside the city limits, so he looked outward. He leveraged his massive, growing celebrity. This was the early era of Twitter, where he was answering citizen complaints directly to his million-plus followers in real time to bring in outside philanthropic and corporate money.
He essentially monetized his own fame and national profile for the city's financial benefit.
Yes. He created a highly unique philanthropy liaison role within the formal city government structure. This was an office specifically designed to extract grants from private, wealthy foundations across the country.
And it was highly effective in the short term, raising $48 million. This outside capital funded crucial initiatives that the city budget couldn't afford, like a prisoner reentry program that the data showed cut recidivism rates significantly.
But the absolute pinnacle, the most famous example of this outsider strategy is the legendary dinner at the Sun Valley Retreat with Facebook founder Mark Zuckerberg.
The narrative is almost cinematic. Booker, the mayor of a struggling city, sits down with Zuckerberg, one of the wealthiest tech titans on the planet, and pitches him.
And the result is a staggering $200 million matched donation intended to completely overhaul Newark's failing public school system.
What is fascinating to analyze here is the concept of the virtuous cycle in urban development that this massive influx of outside money triggered.
Capital attracts capital. Corporate development followed the philanthropic spotlight. During his tenure, the city saw $1 billion in real estate development.
Major corporations took notice of the momentum. Panasonic relocated its North American headquarters to downtown Newark, though it's crucial to note they received a $102 million tax break from the state to do so.
Right. And Goldman Sachs invested $110 million to build Teachers Village, which was a massive mixed-use development specifically designed to provide affordable housing to keep educators living within the city limits.
It sounds like an absolute miracle turnaround on paper. You bring in the tech money, the corporate headquarters, the new real estate.
It does sound great.
But the sources, particularly the local municipal archives, are incredibly clear about the intense criticisms and the mechanical failures during this time.
Despite this massive influx of outside cash and glowing national magazine covers, systemic issues stubbornly persisted. The unemployment rate hovered around 14%, which was nearly double the national average at the time.
A staggering 43% of the city's children were still living below the poverty line. And violent crime, while fluctuating, remained a persistent daily threat to residents.
This starkly highlights the limitations of the outsider strategy. Philanthropy and massive corporate tax incentives can spur beautiful downtown development, they can build new glass office towers and coffee shops, but they do not automatically solve deep generational poverty or systemic street violence.
Right. A $102 million tax break for Panasonic does not necessarily translate into jobs for the residents of the brick towers.
Furthermore, the strategy itself became a massive political liability for Booker at the local level.
The absentee mayor label. A local municipal publication meticulously tracked his schedule and noted that over an 18-month period, Booker was physically out of the state 21.7% of the time.
He was appearing on late-night television talk shows, networking with billionaires in Silicon Valley, giving paid speeches.
Local critics, including prominent members of the New York City Council, argued vehemently that he was looking after his own national political profile, rather than managing the granular, day-to-day administrative affairs of the city.
There was a very vocal local sentiment of, you are bringing in outsiders to dictate our schools and our downtown, but you are not utilizing the talent or listening to the voices within the city itself.
Which brings us to the core tension of local governance in a distressed municipality. Relying on outside billionaires and national media was arguably a necessary survival tactic for a functionally bankrupt city.
Let's be analytical. Without Booker's specific, unique celebrity, Newark likely does not secure that $200 million school grant, and it likely does not attract the Panasonic headquarters.
His user interface was the only asset the city had left to trade.
But locally, that same behavior breeds deep resentment. It creates a narrative that the mayor is performing for a national audience, building his resume for higher office, rather than serving the immediate, unglamorous needs of the residents filling the potholes.
It really makes you wonder about the raw math of municipal survival. If you are a voter in a city that's failing, facing a massive deficit and a shrinking tax base, do you actually care if your mayor is on television constantly and traveling out of state a fifth of the time, as long as that behavior brings in hundreds of millions of dollars in investment that your city desperately needs?
Or does the resentment of an absentee leader outweigh the financial benefits? Does the end justify the means when the city budget is on life support?
It's a profound question of civic philosophy that every distressed city faces. Do voters prefer a present, diligent manager who sits at his desk every day, presiding over a managed, inevitable economic decline? Or do they prefer an absentee rainmaker who brings in vital capital but ignores the granular details of city management?
Booker chose the rainmaker path, and it propelled him to the national stage.
So let's follow that propulsion. When Booker transitions to the United States Senate, the architecture of his strategy changes entirely. He swaps the strategy of courting private tech billionaires for the strategy of courting his staunchest political opponents.
Which is a huge shift.
How does a progressive Democrat from New Jersey, a guy who built his brand fighting slumlords, work with the most conservative elements in the Senate without completely alienating his base?
This transition requires a masterful, highly delicate balancing act. We see the mechanics of this most clearly with the passage of the First Step Act in 2018. This was a massive, landmark piece of federal criminal justice reform, and it was deeply, genuinely bipartisan.
Right. Booker teamed up with conservative Republican senators, specifically libertarians and constitutional conservatives like Rand Paul and Mike Lee, to get this passed.
The back-end code in action.
We hear criminal justice reform thrown around constantly, but what did the First Step Act actually do mechanically to the system?
It fundamentally altered the trajectory of the federal prison system. On a practical level, it expanded job training and educational programs designed to reduce recidivism.
Okay.
It expanded early release programs, allowing inmates who demonstrated good behavior and participated in rehabilitative programming to earn time credits to shorten their sentences.
Crucially, it reduced mandatory minimum sentences for certain nonviolent drug offenders, giving judges more discretion.
It also included a virtual ban on the use of juvenile solitary confinement in federal facilities, which was a provision Booker actively, personally pushed for during the negotiations.
Now, to truly understand the mechanics of how this bipartisan alliance works, we need to look at a highly specific Supreme Court amicus brief from the sources.
Yes.
This is from a 2024 case, Hewitt v. United States. Senator Booker, alongside those exact same conservative senators, Dick Durbin, Chuck Grassley, Mike Lee, submitted this formal brief to the Supreme Court. They were arguing about the retroactive application of a very specific part of their bill, Section 403.
Section 403 is vital to understanding the harshness of the old system. Before the First Step Act, if a defendant was convicted of multiple gun charges in a single proceeding under a specific federal statute, the law required the judge to impose consecutive 25-year mandatory minimum sentences for each subsequent charge. This is a practice known in the legal system as stacking. It meant that a first-time offender facing a single indictment with multiple counts could face incredibly long, stacked sentences, sometimes 105 years or more, simply because multiple charges were brought at once, rather than in separate sequential trials.
It's a mathematical trapdoor. And Section 403 of their bill effectively closed that trapdoor. It reduced that stacked 25-year sentence down to 5 years for offenders who did not have a prior finalized conviction.
But the legal battle at the Supreme Court in the Hewitt case wasn't about the law itself. It was about retroactivity and a highly technical concept called vacatur. Let's break that down.
So vacatur basically means the appellate court takes a giant legal eraser to your sentence. It's wiped clean as if you never stood before the judge.
Right.
But what fascinates me is the loophole they were fighting over.
The loophole is a masterclass in legal syntax. As the brief elegantly explains, when a sentence is vacated, it is rendered void ab initio, which is Latin for from the beginning.
The original sentence simply ceases to exist in the eyes of the law.
The defendant must be brought back and resentenced as if it is their very first time standing before the judge.
So in this Hewitt case, you had individuals who were sentenced before the First Step Act was passed. They got hit with these massive, devastating 105-year stacked sentences under the old harsh rules.
Yeah.
Then, while sitting in prison, they won an appeal on some other legal ground. Their massive sentences were vacated, erased, and they were sent back to the trial court to be resentenced. But by the time they got back to the trial court, the First Step Act had become the law of the land.
Precisely. And the argument that Booker and the conservative senators made to the Supreme Court was that Section 403, the new lenient 5-year rule, must apply to these pre-act offenders facing resentencing.
Their argument hinged on the exact wording of the statute, which stated the new rules applied to any offense where a sentence has not been imposed.
Because the original sentence was vacated, legally speaking, a sentence has not been imposed. Therefore, they argued, the new 5-year mandatory minimum should apply, not the old 25-year stacking rule.
They argued passionately that for a judge to apply the old repealed law to a newly wiped slate violates the entire intent and purpose of their bipartisan reform, which was specifically designed to eliminate these unjustly harsh, one-size-fits-all punishments.
It is truly fascinating to see Cory Booker, a progressive Democrat from New Jersey, locking arms with Mike Lee, a staunch conservative from Utah, and arguing legal syntax regarding the present perfect tense of the phrase has not been imposed in front of the 9 justices of the Supreme Court.
That is serious, deep in the weeds, back-end code. But here's where the operating system analogy really starts to show some friction. You contrast this quiet, highly technical, bipartisan legal maneuvering with his progressive hallmarks.
Because while he's working with Mike Lee on syntax, he's also aggressively courting the left wing of his party with massive structural proposals.
The contrast is incredibly stark. On criminal justice, he finds deep common ground with libertarians and constitutional conservatives. But on healthcare and the broader economy, he champions the defining, sweeping, progressive policies of the era.
Take the Medicare for All Act of 2019. He didn't just support it, he actively joined Senator Bernie Sanders as an original co-sponsor to propose a fundamental root and branch transformation of the American healthcare system.
The mechanism of Medicare for All isn't just expanding coverage. The proposal was to eliminate profit-driven health insurance corporations entirely. No more private premiums, no more deductibles. The state covers every resident through an improved, expanded Medicare plan.
And the sources note Booker's explicit mathematical rationale for supporting this. The United States spends far more per capita on healthcare, more than twice the average of other developed nations, and yet, despite all that money in the system, we suffer worse outcomes on the most basic measures of a healthy society, like maternal and infant mortality rates.
It's a massive structural overhaul proposal that aims to remove the profit motive from biological survival. And he coupled that healthcare overhaul with equally massive economic proposals, most notably baby bonds.
This is a fascinating mechanism designed to address generational poverty. The idea is that the federal government would provide a low-risk savings account seeded with federal funds for every single newborn in the country.
The accounts would grow over time through compound interest, and the individual could access the funds when they reach age 18 to be used for wealth-building activities like buying a home or paying for higher education.
Let's look at the math on that, because the university analysis cited in the sources is striking. The stated goal isn't just to give kids a graduation present. The mathematical goal is to virtually close the racial wealth gap among young adults.
Because the wealth gap isn't just about income. It's about the generational transfer of assets, which was historically denied to minority communities through practices like redlining. If the federal government steps in and seeds that compound interest from birth, the math shows it dramatically levels the playing field by age 18.
It is a profound, mathematically driven approach to equity. And we cannot forget his approach to environmental justice. He proposed a massive $3 trillion climate plan.
The mechanical goals were incredibly ambitious, achieving 100% carbon-free electricity by the year 2030, implementing a carbon fee and dividend structure, and the creation of a massive environmental justice fund.
A carbon fee and dividend is an interesting mechanism. It essentially charges fossil fuel producers a fee for the carbon they emit at the source, and then redistributes that collected money directly back to the public as a dividend check, incentivizing the market to move away from carbon while protecting consumers from energy price spikes.
And that environmental justice fund specifically aimed to physically replace lead-contaminated water systems in schools and public housing, and to fund the cleanup of abandoned toxic coal mines that predominantly plague low-income communities. When you look at the combined architecture of Medicare for All, baby bonds, and a $3 trillion climate plan, you are looking at the foundational blueprint of the modern progressive movement. But this is exactly where the friction in his operating system occurs. The sources reveal significant, highly publicized tension between his sweeping progressive policy proposals on the national stage and the corporate realities of representing his specific home state.
Right, because New Jersey isn't just any state. It is the pharmaceutical capital of the world. In 2017, there was a legislative measure introduced to allow the importation of cheaper prescription drugs from Canada.
This is a classic, universally popular progressive goal, lowering the cost of insulin and life-saving medication by bypassing domestic price monopolies. But Booker voted against it, aligning with Senate Republicans to defeat the measure.
His stated reason was procedural. He argued that the specific amendment lacked the necessary safety protocols to ensure the imported drugs wouldn't be counterfeit or dangerous.
However, the immediate progressive backlash was fierce and sustained. Critics and primary opponents quickly pointed out the underlying financial mechanics. Booker is consistently one of the Senate's top financial recipients from the pharmaceutical industry, given their massive footprint in New Jersey.
The narrative immediately shifted from Senator Booker has valid safety concerns about the Canadian supply chain to Senator Booker is protecting the profit margins of his largest corporate donors at the expense of sick Americans.
And we see a very similar friction regarding big tech. When other leading progressives were loudly calling for the arbitrary, immediate breakup of massive tech monopolies, companies like Amazon or Google Booker explicitly refused to endorse that approach.
He stated publicly that a president shouldn't just run around pointing at specific companies and demanding they be broken up without a legal process. He argued that the government should instead rely on the established mechanics of existing antitrust laws and empower the Federal Trade Commission to do its job through the courts.
This raises a critical question about how a legislator actually functions when ideology collides with constituency. How does a senator balance being one of the Senate's most vocal progressives, a man who is famously vegan, a fierce advocate for animal welfare, who actually proposed a bill to phase out large factory farming operations entirely, while simultaneously protecting the massive pharmaceutical conglomerates and corporate interests that form the vital economic and employment backbone of his home state.
I think the most accurate way to view this is through the lens of a diversified financial portfolio. If you are Cory Booker operating in this hyper-polarized environment, you invest heavily in these high-risk, high-reward progressive ideals. Medicare for all, baby bonds, ending factory farming, the 25-hour protest speech.
These investments yield massive dividends with the progressive activist base. They generate huge media attention, and they build your national brand.
But to ensure you actually deliver tangible results to your local constituents and to maintain your institutional power and donor base, you must anchor your record with reliable, low-yield bipartisan bonds.
Things like the First Step Act meant securing infrastructure funding, protecting local industries from disruptive legislation. If you want to survive a 20-year career in the Senate, you absolutely need both the high-risk ideals and the low-yield pragmatism.
When the user interface, the progressive ideals, crashes into the back-end code voting to protect pharma, that's the friction of governance.
It's a strategy of highly adaptable pragmatism. You maintain absolute ideological purity in your long-term rhetorical vision, but you operate with calculated, sometimes messy pragmatism in your immediate, day-to-day legislative votes.
So let's look at how that adaptable pragmatism functions in the immediate present. We're moving from his historical legislative record to his exact actions in the 2025 and 2026 landscape.
This is where the bipartisan dealmaker, the guy working with Mike Lee on sentencing reform, has been forced to evolve into a fierce, institutional bouncer against the executive branch.
The environment changed, so his tactics had to change. In an era of intense polarization where the executive branch aggressively bypasses the legislature, bipartisanship often takes a backseat to raw institutional oversight.
The bipartisan toolkit becomes useless if the institution itself is under threat. The sources detail several major, highly visible clashes. On the domestic front, we see him aggressively confronting the Department of Homeland Security.
During a tense Senate Judiciary Committee hearing in 2026, he engaged in a direct confrontation with DHS Secretary Kristi Noem. He systematically caught her in logical contradictions while she was under oath regarding the specific numbers and tactics of icy arrests involving American citizens, and he ultimately demanded her immediate resignation or formal impeachment.
And he paired this intense institutional resistance with a massive, mathematically aggressive new economic proposal. In the spring of 2026, he announces the Keep Your Pay Act.
This isn't just a minor tax tweak or a small deduction. The mechanism of this proposal is staggering. It aims to make the first $75,000 of income completely tax-free for households filing jointly at the federal level,
With proportional significant tax relief for single filers as well. The mechanism required to pay for this massive reduction in middle-class taxation is where the friction lies.
To offset the trillions in lost revenue, the bill proposes unrigging the tax system by aggressively, structurally taxing the wealthiest individuals and closing loopholes for large corporations. It's a fundamental, massive redistribution of the national tax burden.
He's also pushing incredibly hard on the mechanics of public health. He demanded the FDA use its immediate executive authority to ban 4 specific, highly toxic solvents, including benzene and methylene chloride from the American food supply chain, citing extensive data linking them to cancer.
And he reintroduced the Fair Wages for Incarcerated Workers Act, which is an attempt to mathematically mandate the federal minimum wage and basic labor protections for people working inside the prison system, essentially trying to abolish the financial incentive for mass incarceration.
Notice the structural pattern of his current operating system. He's operating on 2 highly distinct tracks simultaneously. One track is focused purely on fundamental, immediate, kitchen table pocketbook issues. Keeping more of your paycheck, ensuring the chemicals in your food don't cause cancer, demanding fair wages for labor.
The other track is focused entirely on high-level constitutional theory and procedural warfare against the executive branch.
Which brings us to the most complex part of his portfolio: foreign policy and the mechanics of war powers. In 2026, alongside a bipartisan group dubbed the Senate Six, Booker forced a formal vote on a war powers resolution, specifically aimed at withdrawing United States armed forces from hostilities against Iran.
Let's break down the mechanics of the War Powers Act. He was directly challenging the military authority of the administration, arguing the fundamental constitutional tension between Article 1, which gives Congress the sole power to declare war, and Article 2, which makes the president the commander-in-chief.
He argued that engaging in these specific hostilities against Iran without a formal debated act of Congress was fundamentally unconstitutional.
He's attempting to assert the legislative branch's constitutional authority over matters of war and peace, acting as a direct counterweight to executive overreach. But his foreign policy record also contains profound, deeply controversial complexities, particularly regarding the ongoing Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
This is where we need to spend some time because the tension here is massive. The sources show that while he frequently champions human rights globally, he has alienated significant vocal portions of his progressive allies regarding his voting record on Israel.
Despite rising death tolls, international condemnation, and severe humanitarian crises in the region, Booker has consistently utilized his back-end code to vote in favor of massive arms sales to Israel.
In 2025, literally just days after he finished his viral 25-hour marathon speech protesting the administration, he walked back onto the floor and voted against legislation backed by Bernie Sanders that would have structurally blocked military aid to Israel.
The friction here between his user interface and his back-end code is at its absolute maximum. His argument to his base, as detailed extensively in the sources, is highly specific.
He argues that restricting security guarantees and military hardware to an established ally will not mathematically achieve the progressive goal of ending the war, nor will it magically increase the flow of vital humanitarian aid.
He maintains a frame stance that Israel has a non-negotiable fundamental right to exist as a secure state free from the threat of terrorism, while he simultaneously advocates for the long-term diplomatic mechanics of a two-state solution.
It makes you wonder about the mathematical reality of these policy demands. If you are a voter looking at that Keep Your Pay Act, hearing that your first $75,000 is entirely tax-free sounds like a brilliant, necessary lifeline. It's an economic reset.
But if you also demand Medicare for all, a $3 trillion climate plan, and baby bonds, where does the state actually find the money to run the machine?
How do you fund the largest expansion of the federal government in history while simultaneously axing a huge chunk of your most reliable middle-class income tax base? Can you actually demand massive federal programs and massive tax cuts at the exact same time without breaking the system?
It's the ultimate mathematical paradox of modern economic policy. You must simultaneously fund the massive apparatus of the government while appeasing an electorate that is feeling intense, crushing economic pressure at the grocery store.
The math requires an unprecedented reliance on extracting wealth from the absolute highest earners, which faces enormous, perhaps insurmountable legislative hurdles in a divided government.
So we have tracked a truly unique, highly mechanical political trajectory today. We started with a young, elite lawyer living in the crumbling brick towers of Newark, figuring out how to provide legal aid to tenants fighting systemic housing failures.
We watched him evolve into a supermayor, physically pulling people from fires while simultaneously courting tech billionaires to plug a $118 million hole in a bankrupt city's budget.
We traced his path to the Senate, where he utilized complex legal syntax regarding vacatur to pass landmark bipartisan criminal justice reform with his most conservative rivals.
And finally, we saw him transform into a resistance leader, standing at a lectern for 25 grueling, dehydrated hours to protest the executive branch while quietly securing an algorithmically perfect score for his causal legislation.
It is a comprehensive profile defined entirely by adaptable pragmatism. He has demonstrated a willingness to utilize absolutely whatever tool is necessary in the immediate moment to advance his position, whether that tool is a viral, emotionally charged social media live stream, a quiet, highly technical compromise with a fierce political rival, or a grueling physical endurance test on the floor of the United States Senate.
If that leaves us with a final provocative thought for you to consider as we close out this analysis, we live in an era defined by extreme polarization, an era where voters increasingly demand total, uncompromising ideological purity from their leaders.
In that environment, is there still a viable path to the highest offices in the land for a politician whose entire operating system is defined by this kind of adaptable, sometimes contradictory pragmatism?
When the history books are finally written about this specific, chaotic era of American politics, will they remember the complex back-end bills that required painful, unpopular compromise with the opposition? Or will they only remember the user interface, the viral 25-hour speeches where the politician refused to yield a single inch?
The answer to that question will likely define the future mechanics of how American legislation is actually drafted and passed for the next generation.
It's a tremendous amount to think about. Thank you so much for staying with us until the end of this analysis. We really appreciate your time, your curiosity, and your willingness to examine the mechanics behind the headlines. Please encourage everyone you know to subscribe to the show, and we bid you a fond farewell until next time.